He was humiliated in front of hundreds of students, insulted because of the color of his skin. But instead of fighting back with anger, he stood tall, and what he did next changed the entire world. This is the story of Malik Carter, a young black student who faced hate with grace, turned humiliation into hope, and proved that forgiveness is stronger than revenge. From being mocked in a university hall to speaking on the world's biggest stage, this is a journey that will touch your heart, challenge your beliefs, and remind you of what true strength really looks like. Because sometimes the loudest power in the world isn't anger, it's kindness. And by the end of this story, you'll understand how one act of forgiveness can change millions of lives, including yours. Welcome to Brain Fuel, where real stories light up real hearts. Every week, we bring you true tales of courage, humanity, and change, stories that make you feel, think, and believe again. So hit that subscribe button, because today's story will change how you see forgiveness forever. Did you really think someone like you could ever belong here? Those words sliced through the air like a cold blade. The room fell silent, completely silent. Hundreds of students, parents, and professors sat frozen in the large university auditorium, their cheers suddenly strangled in their throats. The echo of that insult seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with shock and disbelief. Standing under the bright stage lights was a young man named Malik Carter, his hands still holding the shining gold trophy he had just been awarded. The light glimmered off the polished metal, but Malik barely noticed it. He could only hear that voice again in his head, sharp, angry, and filled with something much darker than disappointment. He looked out toward the crowd and saw where the voice had come from, a woman in the third row, dressed in an expensive navy blue coat, her expression hard, eyes cold as ice. She was known by almost everyone there. Mrs. Eleanor Hensley, a wealthy donor to university and one of the most influential figures on campus. Her husband's name was engraved on one of the buildings. People whispered that her family's money practically kept the place running. And yet, at that moment, no one dared to say a word. Malik stood motionless. The microphone was still in front of him. The applause that had filled the hall just a moment ago had vanished into stunned silence. His mouth felt dry. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. He wanted to say something, anything, but his mind was blank for a moment. He was only 19 years old, a sophomore student who had just made history. Malik had become the first black student in the university's century-old history to win the state intercollegiate debate championship. Not just locally, but statewide, beating competitors from some of the most prestigious colleges in the country. It was supposed to be his moment of triumph. A dream come true after months of grueling preparation, sleepless nights, and countless sacrifices. And now, in the very moment of his victory, someone had tried to strip it away with one cruel sentence. The weight of the insult pressed down on him. His throat tightened. But more than hurt, Malik felt a strange kind of stillness, as if time had slowed down and the world was watching to see what he would do. He could see the faces around the hall, professors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, fellow students staring with wide eyes, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard. The judges looked frozen, hands hovering awkwardly above the table. A few people muttered under their breath, but no one spoke loudly. No one challenged her. And that silence said more than words ever could. Malik's mind raced. He thought about his journey, the long, painful path that had brought him here. He remembered growing up in a small town where people whispered behind his back every time he raised his hand in class. He remembered how, in high school, teachers doubted his abilities because of where he came from. He remembered studying by candlelight when the power went out, promising himself that one day he would prove every single one of them wrong. And he had. This victory, this moment, was supposed to be proof that hard work and intelligence could break barriers. It was supposed to show that talent wasn't limited by race or background. But in the blink of an eye, that hateful voice had tried to rewrite his story, to make his success seem like an accident, an intrusion, something undeserved. He felt the old anger stirring deep inside him, the anger of years spent fighting to be seen as equal. But then, he remembered something his mother used to say when he was little. Don't let anyone decide your worth. People try to define you with their words, but you define yourself with your actions. Her voice echoed softly in his heart now, calming the storm that threatened to rise. Malik slowly lowered the trophy to the table beside him and took one step closer to the microphone. The audience was so quiet that you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. He looked out into the crowd again, not just at Mrs. Hensley, but at everyone. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't broken. It was composed, calm, almost gentle, but there was fire behind his eyes. He didn't say a word yet. He just looked around, letting the silence stretch. The tension in the room was unbearable. Even Mrs. Hensley shifted slightly, perhaps realizing she'd gone too far, but pride kept her chin raised. Malik's fingers trembled slightly, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was steady. "Excuse me," he said softly, but his tone carried through the entire auditorium. "Could you repeat that?" The woman didn't answer. She stared back defiantly, but she didn't speak again. Malik smiled faintly, not mockingly, not angrily, just a calm, almost serene smile. "I didn't think so," he said. A small ripple reaction moved through the audience. A few gasps, a few nods. Malik straightened his posture, his hands clasped in front of him, and looked out at the sea of faces again. He knew the cameras were rolling, that hundreds of people were filming this. He knew that whatever he said next would be remembered. But before speaking, he took a moment to breathe. He wanted his words to come not from anger, but from truth. Inside, Malik was thinking, if I respond with hate, I'll only prove her right. But if I respond with grace, I'll prove her wrong in front of everyone. And so he waited. The silence grew heavier, thicker. Everyone was leaning forward, waiting for him to explode, to lash out, to give her what she deserved. But he didn't. He looked down at his trophy, the symbol of his achievement. Then back at the crowd, his voice low but firm. "You know," he said slowly, "I've spent my whole life hearing people tell me where I don't belong. But every time someone says that, it only reminds me that I've already come farther than they ever expected." The words weren't angry, but they hit like thunder. The audience didn't move. Even Mrs. Hensley's expression faltered for the briefest moment. Malik didn't say anything else. He just nodded once, stepped back from the microphone, and waited. And in that moment, before the applause, before the cameras, before the headlines, something powerful filled the air. It wasn't just about race or competition or pride. It was about courage. The quiet, unshakable courage of a young man who refused to let hate define him. That was the moment everything changed. The applause didn't come right away. The room stayed frozen, like the entire world had stopped spinning for a few seconds. The sound of Malik's calm voice still hung in the air, and no one seemed to know what to do with it. He stood there on stage, motionless, the microphone catching the faint sound of his breathing. His heart was racing, but his face didn't show it. He didn't need to speak anymore. His silence had become the loudest thing in the room. It was a strange kind of silence, heavy, tense, almost painful. Every second felt like a minute. The lights above the stage buzzed softly. Someone coughed in the back row, and still no one said a word. Malik glanced toward the woman who had insulted him, Mrs. Eleanor Hensley. Her face was red now, but not from shame, from anger. Her pride had been wounded. She didn't expect him to stand his ground so calmly, so confidently. She thought he would shrink, stammer, maybe even cry. But instead, he looked back at her with quiet strength, and that strength scared her more than any argument ever could. Mrs. Hensley shifted in her seat, clutching her handbag a little tighter, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. She muttered something under her breath, but no one dared to respond. Everyone was watching Malik. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him. Classmates, teachers, reporters, even the dean himself. They were all waiting for him to do something, to react, to explode, to speak again. But Malik didn't move. He didn't have to, in that stillness. His mind began to wander back to the reason he was even here. He had entered the debate championship not for fame, not for glory, but to prove to himself that his voice mattered, that words could build bridges instead of walls. When he joined the debate team 2 years ago, he was nervous, quiet, the kind of student most people overlooked. But he had something most people didn't, determination. He studied speeches from great leaders, practiced every night, and slowly, People began to notice. His coach, Professor Allen, had once told him something that stuck with him. The most powerful voice in the room isn't always the loudest one, Malik. Sometimes it's the one that speaks truth when everyone else is silent. And tonight, right now, that truth was being tested. Malik looked down at the edge of the stage, where the trophy still glimmered under the spotlight. He could see his reflection faintly in the metal. Calm eyes, steady posture, no sign of fear. He had come too far to let anyone take that away from him. The audience didn't know what to feel. Some were uncomfortable. Others looked inspired. A few were even ashamed of their own silence. They realized that what had just happened wasn't just an insult. It was a moment of truth. The dean, sitting in the front row, shifted uneasily in his seat. His reputation depended on the university's image, and this was the kind of scandal that could destroy it. But he also knew something else, that stepping in now, to silence either Malik or the woman, would only make things worse. So he stayed quiet too. A camera clicked from the side of the stage. Then another. Reporters had started taking photos. This was no longer just a local event. It was a story. A black student, humiliated during his victory, standing tall while a powerful woman exposed her prejudice. It was the kind of story that the internet would eat alive. But Malik didn't care about that. He wasn't thinking about cameras or headlines. All he could think about was what his grandmother used to tell him when he was little. When a storm comes, baby, don't run. Stand still, because storms don't last forever, but strength does. He remembered sitting on her porch during summer rainstorms, watching lightning flash across the sky. Terrified but fascinated, she'd always smile and say, "See? Even thunder can't hurt you if you don't fear it." And tonight, that memory gave him strength. He looked back up and noticed something unexpected. Some of the students in the front rows were smiling at him. Not mockingly, not pityingly, but with admiration. They saw what he had just done. They saw a man stand his ground with dignity, when anyone else would have lost control. A girl in the second row whispered to her friend, "He's incredible." Another student muttered, "Man, that's courage right there." Those whispers, small, almost hidden, gave Malik comfort. Because sometimes support doesn't come from loud applause. Sometimes it comes from quiet respect. Mrs. Hensley, however, wasn't used to being challenged, especially not publicly. She crossed her arms and leaned back in her seat, her jaw tight. Her assistant beside her whispered nervously, "Maybe we should leave, ma'am." But she didn't move. Pride wouldn't let her. And that's when something remarkable happened. An elderly professor, Dr. Shaw, a soft-spoken literature teacher, slowly stood up from his seat near the back. The entire audience turned toward him as his voice echoed through the hall. "Mrs. Hensley," he said gently, "I think you owe this young man an apology." Gasps rippled through the audience. No one ever dared to speak to her that way. Mrs. Hensley's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me," she said sharply. Dr. Shaw didn't back down. "You heard me," he said calmly. "This young man just achieved something remarkable, and you chose to insult him instead of honor him. That's not just rude, it's disgraceful." For a moment, it felt like lightning had struck the room. The power dynamic had shifted again. The crowd began to murmur, louder now. Some clapped softly. Others nodded in agreement. The silence had been broken. The tide was turning. Malik turned toward Dr. Shaw, his eyes wide with gratitude. He didn't expect anyone to stand up for him. Not here. Not now. But the old professor just smiled and nodded as if to say, "You're not alone." Mrs. Hensley said nothing. She turned away, pretending to check her phone, but everyone could see the embarrassment written across her face. Malik took another breath and finally found the courage to speak again. He leaned into the microphone and said quietly, "Thank you, sir, but I don't need an apology." The audience fell silent again, waiting. Malik's tone was steady, firm, but kind, because what she said tonight doesn't define me. It defines her, and I think that's punishment enough. This time, the applause came, slowly at first, then building, stronger, louder, echoing across the hall. The students rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, and Malik finally allowed himself a small, humble smile. The storm had passed, but something told him this was only the beginning. As the applause finally died down and the sound of clapping faded into a gentle hum, Malik stood still on the stage, his face calm, his posture composed. But inside, his heart was trembling. He wasn't shaking from fear anymore. He was shaking from everything he'd held inside for years. He forced a small smile, the kind that hides more than it shows. That smile wasn't pride. It wasn't victory. It was survival. The same kind of smile he had learned to wear a long time ago, when the world first tried to make him feel less than who he was. While the audience saw a young man standing strong in the face of hate, Malik knew the truth. This moment wasn't new. It was just another version of something he'd been facing his entire life. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. Faces that were mostly unfamiliar. Faces that had once looked past him in hallways or underestimated him in classrooms. He wondered how many of them had ever felt what he felt growing up. The quiet sting of being judged before you even open your mouth. His mind began to drift, pulling him backward, back to a small town miles away from this grand university auditorium, back to the cracked pavement, dusty playgrounds, and the tiny one-room classroom where he first learned how cruel the world could be. He was 9 years old the first time someone called him a slur. It came from a boy in his class, the son of a local shopkeeper. Malik still remembered the sting of that word, how it landed like a slap across his face, though no one had touched him. The teacher didn't say anything. She just kept writing on the board, pretending not to hear. That silence, that complicity, was worse than the insult itself. That night, Malik had come home crying. His mother, tired from her shift at the hospital, listened quietly as he told her what happened. She didn't interrupt him. When he was done, she knelt in front of him, wiped the tears from his cheeks, and said softly, "Baby, don't you ever let anyone tell you who you are. You hear me? Their words can only hurt you if you start believing them." He nodded back then, not fully understanding. But as he stood now, years later, staring into a crowd of hundreds, he finally understood what she meant. Malik's mother had been his first hero, a single parent who worked double shifts just to keep him in school. She never had much, but she gave him everything that mattered: faith, love, and strength. Every night before bed, she'd remind him, "Your skin is not your weakness, it's your armor." He carried those words with him like a shield. Every time someone looked down on him, every time a teacher ignored his raised hand, every time he felt invisible, those words whispered in the back of his mind, pushing him forward. But the world didn't make it easy. In middle school, he was placed in the remedial reading group, not because he couldn't read, but because the teacher assumed he couldn't keep up. It took months before anyone noticed that he was actually ahead of the class. When he finally transferred to the advanced section, he felt like he had climbed a mountain barefoot. High school wasn't any kinder. He remembered standing in the cafeteria line when a group of seniors laughed at his shoes, secondhand sneakers his mom had bought from a thrift store. He remembered how his face burned with shame, how badly he wanted to disappear. But then he also remembered walking into his first debate club meeting a week later, nervous, shaking, but determined. That's where he found his voice. At first, no one took him seriously. He was quiet, unsure, his stutter noticeable when he got nervous. But he listened. He learned. He studied every great speaker he could: Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama. He practiced in front of the mirror for hours, mimicking their cadence, their rhythm, their strength. And little by little, his fear began to fade. He remembered his first debate win. It wasn't big, just a local tournament. But when he came home with that small medal around his neck, his mother cried. "You see," she told him, "you didn't have to change who you are to be great. You just had to believe it first." Those words became his anchor. As Malik grew older, he realized that life kept giving him versions of the same test. Different people, different places, but the same challenge. Will you let them define you? And tonight, on that stage, in front of hundreds of people and a woman who thought her status could silence him, Malik had passed that test again. But what no one saw, what the cameras couldn't capture, was the pain behind that victory. Because standing strong doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Inside, Malik still felt the sting of all the times he'd been underestimated, All the times people saw his skin before they saw his potential. Every insult, every dismissal, every door closed in his face. They were all pieces of the armor he now wore. As the crowd began to settle again, he could hear faint whispers from the back. People talking about how graceful he had been, how poised, how mature. But Malik knew something deeper. Grace isn't born from comfort. It's born from pain. He took another slow breath, his eyes glancing up toward the ceiling lights. They were blinding, almost harsh, but in their glare, he could almost see his mother's face again, smiling, proud, whispering her favorite saying, "Son, your strength will speak louder than their hate." That was the reason he smiled now, not because he wanted to hide his hurt, but because he had finally turned that hurt into power. He looked down at the trophy beside him, not as a symbol of winning a debate, but as a symbol of surviving everything that tried to silence him. This wasn't just an award for skill. It was a reminder that his voice mattered, that no matter how loud the world's prejudice could be, his truth would always be louder. And that's when he felt it, a shift inside himself, a quiet, peaceful realization that he didn't need to fight to prove his worth anymore. He already had. The woman who insulted him might never truly understand the damage her words carried. But Malik didn't need her understanding. He had already won the battle. She didn't even know she was fighting. Because real victory isn't when the world finally claps for you. It's when you can stand in front of hate and still smile, not because you're unhurt, but because you're unbroken. Malik turned slightly, looking toward the students in the audience. Some were still clapping softly, others just watching him with awe. And though none of them could see it, that small smile on his face held years of pain, resilience, and triumph. The pain behind his smile was real, but so was the strength that came from it. And deep down, Malik knew this was only the beginning of something far greater. The silence was back, thick, heavy, and charged with something no one could name. Malik stood there under blinding white lights, the golden trophy glimmering beside him, his fingers resting gently on the microphone. Around him, the air felt alive, electric, as if every molecule in that room was waiting to hear what he would say next. The crowd's energy had shifted. Moments ago, they had watched a cruel insult break through the celebration. Now, they were watching something else, a kind of quiet power rising from a young man who refused to be broken. Even the cameras in the back of the hall had stopped clicking. The reporters, sensing something extraordinary, held their breath. This wasn't just a college debate anymore. It was about to become something much bigger, a moment people would talk about long after this night was over. Malik took a slow breath. His chest rose and fell steadily, but inside his heart was pounding so hard he could almost hear it echo. He could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes fixed on him. Some curious, some sympathetic, and a few still skeptical. But fear didn't rule him anymore. What replaced it was something stronger, purpose. He looked out into the sea of faces. Some people looked away when he made eye contact, embarrassed by what had happened. Others, mostly students, looked right back at him, their expressions filled with admiration and anticipation. They were waiting for him to speak, to show them how courage sounds. Malik adjusted the microphone slightly. The faint screech of feedback made a few people flinch, but it also pulled everyone's attention back to him completely. The room seemed to shrink, as if there were no walls, no ceiling, just Malik and the truth. He began slowly, his voice calm but clear. "You know," he said, his tone soft yet steady, "when I was a kid, I used to believe the world was divided into good people and bad people." A few heads tilted, intrigued. The simplicity of his words drew them in. "But as I grew older," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience, "I realized it's not that simple. The world isn't just divided by good or bad. It's divided by something deeper, by the people who see others as human beings, and the people who don't." A ripple moved through the crowd, a few murmurs, some nods. Malik's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Each word seemed to sink into the silence and stay there. He paused, not because he didn't know what to say next, but because he understood something most speakers never do. Silence is part of the speech. It's where people think, where words settle. Malik let the pause linger just long enough, then went on. "When you tell someone they don't belong," he said, glancing toward Mrs. Hensley, You're not exposing their weakness. You're exposing your own fear, because hate doesn't come from strength. It comes from insecurity. Mrs. Hensley shifted in her seat. The students around her turned to look. She tried to hide behind an expression of indifference, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her. Malik's tone didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. His voice was calm, controlled, but it struck like thunder. I didn't come here tonight to prove that I belong, he said. I came here because I already knew I did. I came here to prove that excellence has no color, and intelligence doesn't wear a specific skin. Someone in the back started clapping, once, twice, then stopped, unsure if it was the right time. Malik smiled faintly and continued. You see, he said, I've been told all my life to work twice as hard, to be twice as polite, to smile even when I'm insulted, just to be seen as equal. And for years I did exactly that. I thought if I was perfect enough, if I achieved enough, people would stop seeing my color and start seeing my character. He paused, his voice tightening just a little. But I've learned something. Some people will never see you for who you are, no matter how hard you try. And that's not your failure. That's their blindness. The audience was silent again, but this time it wasn't out of awkwardness. It was reverence. They were listening, really listening. Malik wasn't just giving a speech anymore. He was teaching them something they'd never forget. He took another deep breath. The lights were hot now, sweat forming near his temples, but he didn't care. His words were flowing like water, natural, powerful, unstoppable. You can insult me, you can doubt me, you can even hate me, he said, his tone firm, his eyes locked on the crowd. But you can't erase what I've earned. You can't silence what I stand for. Because every time you try, you only remind me how strong I've become. Someone in the audience whispered, Wow! Under their breath, the students in the first few rows leaned forward, captivated. Even professors, some of them old enough to have seen a lifetime of lectures, sat wide-eyed, realizing they were witnessing something historic. Then Malik's voice softened again. You know what's funny? He said with a small, almost playful smile. I used to think moments like this, moments where someone tried to make me feel small, were the worst kind of pain. But now I see it differently. Because every insult, every doubt, every hateful word, it all became fuel. And tonight, I turned that fuel into fire. His hand tightened on the edge of the podium. He wasn't angry. He was alive. That's the thing about people who are used to being underestimated, he said. We learn how to rise in silence. We learn how to turn every insult into motivation. And one day, when we finally speak, the whole world has no choice but to listen. There it was. That was a line that would echo in every video clip, every headline, every heart that heard it. The room erupted. This time not from confusion, but from awe. People began clapping, tentatively at first, then louder, until the sound filled the hall like a storm breaking open the sky. Malik didn't raise his hand for silence. He didn't need to. He just smiled, that same calm, graceful smile that had carried him through every storm. Even through the applause, his eyes found Mrs. Hensley's once more. But there was no anger in them, just understanding. She looked down at the floor, her power suddenly meaningless. Malik leaned slightly into the microphone again and said, almost like a whisper, So, to anyone who still thinks I don't belong, thank you, because you remind me why I'll never stop standing right here. The clapping grew louder, waves of it rolling through the auditorium. Students stood up one by one until the entire hall was on its feet. Cheers, whistles, even tears. People who had been silent minutes ago were now chanting his name, Malik, Malik, Malik. And through it all, he stayed composed, calm in the chaos, humble in his triumph. Because this wasn't just a response to an insult. It was a declaration. A message not just for one woman, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And as he stood there, the lights shining down like stars, Malik knew this wasn't just his victory. It was a voice for every heart that had ever been silenced. The applause thundered through the auditorium like a wave breaking against the shore. It was loud, not just in sound, but in meaning. Every clap, every cheer was more than celebration. It was release. For a moment, Malik just stood there motionless, as if the energy around her were too much to take in all at once. His heart was pounding, but not from nerves, from pride, from gratitude, from the unbelievable realization that his voice had moved people. The same hall that moments ago had been silent with shock was now alive with unity. Students who'd never spoken to each other were clapping side by side. Professors who'd seen decades of debates were standing with tears in their eyes. Even the camera operators had forgotten to film for a second, too caught up in the emotion to think about their job. And right there in the front row, the woman who had started all sat frozen. Mrs. Hensley's face had gone pale, her lips pressed tightly together as if she wanted to say something, to defend herself, maybe, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the loudest voice in the room. Malik noticed her. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply met her eyes again, steady, calm, and compassionate. That look hit her harder than any insult could have. It wasn't filled with hatred or revenge. It was filled with grace. And grace, when shown to someone who's wrong, burns deeper than anger ever could. He stepped back from the microphone as the applause slowly began to fade. Some people were still standing, wiping away tears, others whispering things like, "That was incredible," and "He's right." When the noise finally settled into a soft murmur, Malik did something no one expected. He picked the microphone back up. "I'm not done," he said softly, his voice warm but commanding enough to quiet the entire hall in seconds. Every head turned. Cameras refocused. The world seemed to hold its breath again. "I didn't speak tonight to make anyone feel small," he said. "I spoke to remind us all that words are power, and that we get to choose how we use them." He looked toward Mrs. Hensley again, but this time his tone was gentle. "You see, when you insult someone, you think you're taking something from them. But really, you're giving away something of your own, your peace, your kindness, your humanity. Hate doesn't just hurt others. It corrodes the person who carries it." The room was completely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. Malik continued. "When I was younger, I thought fighting hate meant shouting louder, proving myself over and over again. But now I understand. The strongest answer to hate is not revenge, it's understanding. Because if I respond with anger, I become part of the same darkness I'm trying to rise above." He paused, his words hanging in the air like a melody that no one wanted to end. Then he smiled, soft, humble. "So tonight, I forgive you," he said simply. Gasps rippled through the audience. Mrs. Hensley's head jerked slightly upward. Her eyes widened, shocked. Forgive? After all that humiliation? After being insulted in front of hundreds of people? He was forgiving her? "Yes," Malik said, his voice steady. "I forgive you. Not because what you said was okay, but because I refuse to carry your words as my burden. My dreams are too big for that. My purpose is too strong for that. And my heart," he placed a hand over his chest, "my heart has no room left for hate." That line, "my heart has no room left for hate," would go viral the next morning. It would be printed on posters, quoted in classrooms, shared across millions of screens. But in that moment, it wasn't a quote. It was truth. Mrs. Hensley's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink them away, but it was too late. Her composure cracked. The woman who had once been known for her coldness now sat trembling, exposed by the very kindness she had never shown to others. Malik's voice softened again. "We're all human. We make mistakes. But the real test isn't whether we mess up, it's whether we learn from it, whether we choose to be better tomorrow than we were today." He turned his gaze toward the crowd. "Look around you," he said. "Every single person here comes from a different story, a different struggle. But right now, in this room, we're connected, because for a few moments, we listened, we understood. And that's how change begins." Applause began again, not as wild as before, but deeper, a kind of slow, emotional clapping that felt like a heartbeat. Malik smiled, looked down briefly at his trophy, then back up. "I didn't win this because I'm the smartest," he said. "I won this because I refused to give up, because I believed that my voice mattered even when people tried to silence it." He took a step away from the podium, but turned back one last time. "And to anyone out there who's ever been made to feel like you don't belong, remember this. You don't need their approval to shine. You just need your courage." That final line echoed like thunder. The audience erupted once more, this time standing longer, clapping louder, some even shouting his name again. But this applause was different. It wasn't just admiration. It was belief. Malik had turned an entire hall of spectators into believers. Believers in resilience, in forgiveness, in the strength of the human spirit. And then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Hensley slowly rose from her seat. Every eye turned toward her. She hesitated, her hands trembling, her face flushed with shame. For a moment, no one breathed. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry." The crowd gasped. She looked directly at Malik. "I was wrong. About you, about everything. You showed more strength and grace tonight than I've shown in my whole career." Her voice cracked. "Thank you for teaching me." Malik nodded gently. No arrogance, no triumph, just quiet dignity. "Thank you for listening," he said simply. At that, the entire hall broke into applause again, louder than ever before. Not for Malik alone, but for the moment, for change, for growth. The cameras caught everything. The handshake, the tearful apology, the roar of students rising to their feet. It wasn't just an academic event anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revolution starts not with anger, but with forgiveness. As Malik stepped down from the stage, people reached out to shake his hand, pat his shoulder, thank him. One student, eyes wide with admiration, said, "Man, you didn't just win the debate tonight, you won hearts." Malik smiled, nodded once, and said quietly, "That's the only victory that really matters." Outside, as he walked through the cool night air, the stars shimmered above him, bright, endless, and free, just like his spirit. By the next morning, the world had already changed. The moment Malik walked out of that auditorium, he thought the night was over, that maybe the story would stay within the walls of that hall, remembered only by those who were lucky enough to witness it. But the truth? That night was only the beginning. When the video hit the internet, it spread like wildfire. A student from a journalism club had uploaded it to their social media page, a simple, unedited recording titled, "Black Student Responds to Racism with Unbelievable Grace." Within hours, it had hundreds of shares. By sunrise, it had millions of views. People couldn't stop watching. The video didn't just show a young man giving a speech. It showed a soul standing tall in the face of hate. It showed the power of calmness when the world expects anger. It showed forgiveness in a place no one thought it could exist. Clips from the speech flooded TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Hashtags like hashtag Stand With Malik and hashtag No Room for Hate began trending worldwide. Teachers shared it in classrooms. Parents showed it to their kids. News anchors discussed it on live television. "Who is this young man?" one host asked during a morning news segment. "And how did he manage to respond to hate with such incredible composure?" In one corner of the world, a young boy watched the video on his cracked phone screen, sitting under a streetlight after his night shift. He'd been bullied for years because of his accent, his skin, his clothes. But as he watched Malik speak, the confidence, the honesty, the peace, something shifted in him. For the first time, he felt proud of himself, not ashamed. In another city, a teacher paused her class halfway through a lesson and projected the video onto the whiteboard. The room full of students sat silently as Malik's words echoed through the speakers. "My heart has no room left for hate." When the video ended, no one spoke for a long moment. Then one student whispered, "I want to be like him." Even celebrities began sharing it. An actor tweeted, "This young man just reminded the world what real strength looks like." A senator quoted Malik's line in a speech on unity. A famous motivational speaker posted the clip with the caption, "This is how you change the world, one moment of courage at a time." Everywhere Malik looked, his name was spreading. His social media accounts, which once had a few hundred followers, now had thousands, then millions. Messages poured in from people across the globe. "You gave me hope again. I showed your video to my kids, so they know how to face hate with dignity. You didn't just speak. You healed something in all of us." But amid all the attention, Malik stayed grounded. He still walked to class like before, still sat in the same library corner, still helped his classmates with research papers. He didn't crave fame, he craved purpose. And purpose was calling louder than ever. A few days later, his university organized a formal press conference. The auditorium where it all began was now packed, not with just students, but with reporters, cameras, and guests from around the country. The same spot where a hateful insult had been thrown now stood as a symbol of transformation. As Malik stepped onto the stage again, the crowd rose in applause, longer and louder than before. Reporters leaned forward, microphones ready. He adjusted the mic, smiled, and said, "I didn't expect to be back here so soon." Laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension. Then his tone turned serious. "But maybe this is exactly where I need to be. Because what happened here, what started as a moment of hate, turned into something beautiful. It became a mirror for all of us. It showed that no matter where you're from or what you look like, your response defines your power." He paused. Cameras clicked furiously. "I didn't go viral because I'm special," he continued. "I went viral because deep down, everyone is tired of hate. People are craving compassion. They're hungry for something real, for hope." He looked around the room, his gaze calm but commanding. And hope starts with how we treat each other, even when it's hard. The audience hung on every word. Even Mrs. Hensley was there, sitting quietly in the front row. She had requested to attend, not out of obligation, but out of remorse. When Malik finished, she stood up before anyone else could speak. The hall fell silent again. "I once believed that intelligence meant knowing all the right answers," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But this young man taught me something far more important. True intelligence is having the heart to admit when you're wrong." The crowd clapped softly, touched by her humility. Malik nodded respectfully, his smile gentle but proud. Forgiveness had done what anger never could. It had created change. From that day forward, Malik's life would never be the same. He began receiving invitations from universities, conferences, and international organizations. People wanted to hear his story, not because he was famous, but because he represented something the world desperately needed to remember: humanity. Months passed, and Malik found himself traveling across the country, speaking to thousands of young people. Every time he stood on a stage, he repeated the same message. You can't always control how people treat you, but you can always control what you become because of it. He wasn't just speaking anymore. He was healing people with his words. In schools and prisons and community centers, people of all races, religions, and backgrounds stood to thank him. Some cried. Some hugged him. All left changed. And every single time, Malik remembered that night in the auditorium. The lights, the silence, the insult, and how one moment of courage had rewritten everything. The same words that had once hurt him now fueled a movement that united thousands. The world didn't just hear Malik's story. It felt it. His calm defiance had become a symbol, a reminder that greatness isn't found in revenge, but in rising above it. And while reporters called him the voice of a generation, Malik only smiled when asked what he thought of all the fame. His answer was simple. If my voice helped even one person believe in themselves again, then that's all the success I need. As the years went on, his speech continued to echo through classrooms, homes, and hearts. What began as a painful moment became a timeless message, a reminder that the most powerful weapon against hate is grace. Months had passed since the night that changed everything. Yet the echo of Malik's words still lingered like music that refused to fade. Everywhere he went, people recognized him, not because of fame, but because of how he made them feel. Airports, coffee shops, even the quiet streets near campus. Strangers would stop him, just say, "You gave me courage," or "Because of you, I stood up for myself." But Malik never let the attention go to his head. He'd smile, shake their hands, and say the same humble thing every time. It wasn't me, it was the message. He knew that what had started in that one auditorium had grown into something far bigger, something living, breathing, and unstoppable. News outlets continued to feature him in interviews. His calm presence, his thoughtful pauses, his way of choosing words so carefully that every sentence sounded like truth, it all drew people in. But even while the cameras followed him, Malik wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing change. That's how the idea began. One night, sitting in his small dorm room surrounded by stacks of letters from people around the world, Malik felt something stir inside him. Letters from bullied students. From teachers struggling to unite divided classrooms. From parents who didn't know how to explain prejudice to their children. He read each one, line by line, and realized something profound. People didn't just need inspiration. They needed action. That night, under the dim desk lamp that had seen him through countless study sessions, Malik wrote 3 simple words on a blank notebook. The Belonging Project. It started small. A few classmates joined him, people who'd been there that unforgettable night. They began organizing open forums on campus where students could talk honestly about their fears, their backgrounds, and the walls that kept them apart. Malik didn't lecture. He listened. He encouraged others to speak, to share, to connect. The atmosphere at those meetings was electric, emotional, raw, and healing. For the first time, students who had never understood each other sat side by side, realizing they had more in common than they thought. Within weeks, universities from other states reached out, asking Malik to bring the Belonging Project to their campuses. Soon, he found himself traveling every weekend. From New York to Atlanta, from Chicago to Los Angeles, speaking to packed halls filled with young faces hungry for change. Each event ended the same way, students hugging, crying, promising to be better, not just toward others, but toward themselves. And every single time Malik left the city, a new chapter of the movement began there. By the end of that year, over 100 schools had launched their own versions of the Belonging Project. Posters filled hallways with Malik's words. You don't need to fit in. You were born to belong. Teachers used his speech in lessons on empathy and courage. Companies invited him to talk about leadership and inclusion. And slowly, the ripple became a wave. But with change came criticism, too. Not everyone liked seeing the world shift. Some called him too idealistic. Others accused him of using forgiveness as weakness. Social media, as always, had its share of negativity. Malik read it all, the praise, the criticism, the noise. But he didn't let it define him. He'd smile quietly and remind himself of why he started. Change, he often said, never comes without resistance. Then came a letter that caught him off guard. It was from Mrs. Hensley. Her handwriting was neat, careful, the kind of script that looked like it belonged to someone who had spent years teaching others to write correctly. Dear Malik, it began, I've watched everything you've done since that night, and I needed to say this. You didn't just forgive me, you freed me. I used to see the world through walls and labels, but now I see people. I've started volunteering at a local youth center to mentor kids who face discrimination, kids like you once were. I can never undo the words I said, but I'll spend the rest of my life proving I've changed. Thank you for giving me that chance. Malik read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his journal. He didn't post about it. He didn't brag. But that night, as he looked up at the stars outside his window, he whispered softly to himself, this is what change looks like. Months turned into a year, and the Belonging Project had become an international movement. Documentaries were made. Governments invited Malik to speak about youth empowerment. Schools in other countries streamed his speeches live. And through it all, he stayed the same, humble, kind, deeply grounded. He still walked alone sometimes, headphones in, notebook in hand, always writing, always reflecting. One night after a major event in Washington, D.C., Malik sat backstage with a group of high school students who had traveled hours just to meet him. They asked him, how do you stay so calm when people hate you for no reason? He smiled, thought for a moment, then said, because hate is loud for a moment, but peace echoes forever. The kids nodded, their faces glowing with respect. Then one of them, a shy girl with glasses, whispered, I used to hide my voice. People said my accent sounded funny. But after watching your speech online, I tried out for the school debate team, and I won. Malik laughed softly. That's what I'm talking about, he said. You just turned someone's doubt into your fire. Moments like that fueled him more than any award or recognition ever could. And while the world called him a leader, Malik never stopped seeing himself as a student, a learner of life, of people, of compassion. He knew the fight against hate would never be completely over, but he also knew something far greater. One voice could light thousands more. Every time he walked onto a new stage, he reminded the crowd that change doesn't start in governments or speeches. It starts in a human heart. You don't need to be famous to make an impact, he'd say. You just need the courage to speak with kindness when it's hardest. That line became the soul of his movement. It appeared on murals in classrooms and in songs written by young artists inspired by his story. What began as a painful night in a college hall had now become a global anthem, a movement that taught people to replace anger with empathy and division with belonging. And though Malik was proud, he never forgot where it all began. One insult, one choice, one moment of strength that turned pain into purpose. He often said, "The night that tried to break me was the same night that built me." And with that belief burning bright inside him, Malik knew the world was changing one heart at a time. By the time the second anniversary of the Belonging Project came around, Malik's name had traveled far beyond his university, far beyond the country. It was no longer just a story of one student. It had become a movement that touched hearts across continents. From South Africa to Japan, from London to Brazil, people had heard his speech, shared his message, and found courage in his calm strength. His face, once that of a nervous young man standing at a microphone, now appeared on magazine covers with headlines like "The Voice That Changed a Generation." And yet, if you met him in person, you'd still find the same humility, the same soft smile, the same quiet spark in his eyes that said, "I'm just getting started." Malik's inbox overflowed daily with invitations. Schools, NGOs, even government panels wanted him to speak. He'd turned down many, not because he didn't care, but because he wanted every word he spoke to mean something. Then one day, a letter arrived that made him stop and just stare. It wasn't from a student or a local organizer or a TV host. It was from the United Nations. "Dear Mr. Malik Carter," it read, "we are deeply moved by your advocacy for empathy, equality, and unity. The upcoming Global Youth Summit on Peace and Inclusion will gather voices from across the world to discuss how we build a future free from hate. We would be honored if you would represent your country as our keynote speaker." Malik read the letter 3 times, hardly believing it. The same place he'd seen world leaders speak, the same stage that had hosted global icons, wanted him. He sat back, exhaling slowly. It wasn't pride that filled his chest. It was gratitude. Gratitude for every person who believed in him, for every insult that had pushed him to rise higher. When he told his mom, she couldn't stop crying. "You were born for this," she said over the phone. "But remember, son, speak not to impress the world, but to touch it." A few months later, Malik stood in front of the Grand Marble Building in New York City. Flags from every nation fluttered in the crisp wind. Delegates from around the world walked past him, carrying files, badges, and the weight of their country's hopes. And right there among them stood a young man from a small town, wearing a simple black suit and the calmest expression in the crowd. Inside the massive General Assembly Hall, golden lights gleamed against the polished wood. Rows upon rows of people filled the seats. Diplomats, youth activists, journalists, and leaders from more than 100 countries. The moderator's voice echoed through the chamber. "Please welcome Mr. Malik Carter, founder of the Belonging Project." The applause rolled like thunder. Cameras flashed. Malik walked slowly to the podium, his heart steady, his spirit calm. As he stood before the microphone, this time not as a victim of hate, but as a messenger of unity, he took a deep breath and began. "I never thought I'd stand here," he said softly. 2 years ago, I was just a student giving a speech at my university. I didn't come from money. I didn't come from power. I came from faith. Faith that even one voice, if spoken with truth, could echo further than hate ever could." The hall was silent. Translators whispered his words into dozens of languages, but the emotion behind them didn't need translation. He continued, "We talk about peace as if it's something we build with laws and meetings. But peace begins long before that. It begins in how we treat the person sitting next to us. It begins in classrooms, in families, in hearts." He paused, letting the silence breathe. When I was insulted in front of hundreds, I could have answered with anger, but I chose understanding. Because forgiveness doesn't make you weak, it makes you free. The room was still. Even the clicking of cameras had stopped. Malik raised his eyes and looked around the hall. I stand here today not to talk about what divides us, but to remind us of what connects us, the desire to be seen, respected, and loved. He shared stories from Belonging Project. Stories of kids from rival neighborhoods working together, of classrooms where students replaced mocking with mentorship, of teachers who turned conflict into compassion. These young people, he said, are proof that change doesn't come from powerful speeches. It comes from ordinary people choosing kindness when it's hardest. Then he smiled faintly and added, I'm living proof too. That single line drew a standing ovation. It wasn't the end of his speech, but people couldn't help themselves. The applause was raw, emotional, as if the entire world had been waiting to exhale. Malik waited quietly for the noise to fade, then ended with words that would later be quoted across the globe. If we want to build a world without hate, we must first build hearts without fear, because fear creates enemies, but empathy creates family. The hall erupted again. This time, the applause didn't end for several minutes. Delegates from countries that rarely agreed on anything were standing side by side, clapping for the same message. Later that night, Malik stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the East River. The city lights shimmered across the water like stars falling to earth. The air was cool, carrying the faint hum of New York's endless life. He leaned against a railing, thinking about how far he had come, from a boy once mocked for his skin color to a man whose words now touched the world. But even then, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a servant of something bigger, a truth he had learned the hard way. You don't change the world by shouting louder. You change it by standing taller. The next morning, his face was everywhere. News networks replayed his speech. Newspapers printed headlines like, From Classroom to UN, The Power of Forgiveness. In Kenya, a group of students painted a mural of Malik with the words, No room for hate beneath it. In France, teachers showed his video during lessons about equality. In Pakistan, youth leaders started a campaign called Echoes of Belonging, inspired by his movement. Malik didn't just speak to the world. He united it one heart at a time. Back home, his university renamed the same auditorium where it all began. It was now called the Malik Carter Hall of Unity. And every year on the anniversary of that night, students gathered there not to talk about hate, but to celebrate compassion. Malik often returned quietly, sitting in the back row, watching the new generation take the stage. He didn't always speak. Sometimes he just listened, smiling softly as young voices carried his message forward, because he knew now what true success meant. It wasn't fame. It wasn't applause. It was seeing others believe, seeing others belong. And as he walked out of the hall one last time, the lights reflecting in his eyes, Malik whispered the same words that had started it all. My heart has no room left for hate. Months after Malik's historic UN speech, his life seemed to flow like a dream. His inbox was still full of speaking requests. His project had spread to dozens of countries, and his story had become a lesson in countless schools. But deep inside, Malik carried something heavier, a quiet, unspoken weight. No matter how far he went, one name never left his mind. Rebecca, the woman who had insulted him, the spark that had started everything. He hadn't seen her since that night at the university. After the incident, she had withdrawn from classes for a while. Rumors said she'd moved to another city, maybe even changed schools. Malik never searched for her, not out of hate, but because he wasn't ready. He had forgiven her publicly, yes. But forgiveness in words and forgiveness in the heart are not always the same thing. And sometimes life has a way of bringing back the very people we think we've moved past, just to see if we truly have. It was a warm afternoon in his hometown. Malik had been invited back to his old university to deliver a special lecture. The campus had changed. New buildings, murals of diversity, and a small plaque near the auditorium entrance that read, This hall stands as a reminder that courage and kindness can rewrite the story of hate. Malik smiled when he saw it, but as he walked inside, he noticed something unexpected. Near the front row, sitting quietly with her hands clasped together, was Rebecca. She looked different, older, quieter. Her once sharp eyes were now soft, almost fragile. When their gazes met, she stood up slowly, unsure whether to approach or stay put. For a brief moment, Malik felt the world blur around him. The memories of that night, her words, the laughter, the silence, all came flooding back. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "Mr. Carter," she said softly when he reached her. Her voice trembled, as if each word carried the weight of regret. I didn't think you'd want to see me." Malik nodded slowly. "I didn't think I would either." She swallowed hard. "I've been wanting to talk to you for years. I just didn't know how. I'm sorry, not because the world made me apologize, but because I finally understand what I did. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and I carried that guilt every day." There was silence between them, the kind of silence that holds more truth than words ever could. Malik could feel his old anger whispering to him, reminding him of the humiliation, the pain. But he also felt something else, a deep, calm strength he had spent years building. He took a slow breath. "Rebecca, you don't owe me an apology anymore," he said gently. "You already gave me the greatest gift you could without realizing it." She looked up, confused. "Gift? Yes," Malik said. "You made me find my voice. You made me realize that strength doesn't come from shouting back, but from standing tall. I wouldn't be who I am today without that moment." Her eyes filled with tears. "You mean you really forgave me?" Malik smiled softly. "I forgave you a long time ago. But today, I think I finally feel it." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. The tension that had lived between them for years seemed to dissolve into the air. When Malik stepped onto the stage later that evening, he looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of students waiting eagerly, many of them holding notebooks or phones, ready to capture his every word. He began, as always, with warmth. "Good evening, everyone. Today, I want to talk about something we all find hard. Forgiveness. Not the kind we post about online, but the kind that takes time, tears, and courage." Then, after a pause, he added, "Someone very important to my story is here tonight." The crowd murmured. Rebecca lowered her head, not expecting what came next. "I won't name her out of respect," Malik said, "but she's the reason you're all sitting here today. Because of her, I learned the power of grace. Because of her, I learned that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it transforms it." He continued, his voice strong but gentle. "We live in a world where hate spreads faster than truth. But hate doesn't last. Only understanding does. When we forgive, we don't free the other person. We free ourselves." His words hit differently this time, not just because of the message, but because of the raw emotion behind them. As he finished, the audience erupted in applause. But Malik didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Rebecca, who was crying quietly, clapping through her tears. After the event, she walked up to him again. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Malik smiled. "You just did, by being here, by listening." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Can I do something to help the Belonging Project?" Malik's eyes softened. "Yes, help someone else belong. That's how it starts." And that night, for the first time, Rebecca truly understood what his message had meant all along. It wasn't about speeches or applause. It was about hearts healing, one at a time. In the months that followed, something beautiful happened. Rebecca became one of the most active volunteers in the Belonging Project. She began working with youth programs, sharing her story, not to seek sympathy, but to teach what prejudice costs. During one of her workshops, she stood before a group of teenagers and said, "Once, I thought a person's worth was defined by what they looked like. But then I met someone who showed me what humanity really means." She didn't need to say Malik's name. Everyone already knew. One evening, Malik received a small brown envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note from Rebecca. "Dear Malik, 2 years ago I hurt you. Today, because of you, I've helped others heal. You turned my cruelty into compassion, and that's something I'll spend the rest of my life honoring. Thank you for believing in the better version of me, even when I didn't." Malik folded the note, placed it on his desk, and smiled. It wasn't just forgiveness now. It was closure. As he watched the sunset fade beyond his window, he whispered to himself, maybe the truest victory isn't changing the world. It's changing the heart that once hated you. The auditorium was quiet again. The same hall where Malik had once stood trembling years ago, humiliated, broken, and unsure if his voice mattered, was now filled with hundreds of people waiting just to hear him breathe. It was graduation day at the university. Banners hung high above the walls. The stage shimmered under golden lights, and students in black robes filled every seat. Parents smiled proudly. Teachers whispered to each other about how far their students had come, and the hall buzzed with the warm, restless energy of new beginnings. At the center of it all, a familiar voice was being introduced. "Ladies and gentlemen," the dean said into the microphone, his tone brimming with pride. "Today, we welcome back one of our most remarkable alumni, a man whose courage turned cruelty into compassion, and whose words have changed millions of lives across the world. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Malik Carter." The crowd rose instantly. The applause thundered across the hall like waves crashing against the shore. Phones lifted, cameras flashed, and yet Malik stood there, smiling softly. Humble, calm, his presence powerful in its gentleness. He adjusted the microphone, waited for the cheers to fade, and looked around. The same spot where Rebecca had insulted him years ago. The same aisle where students had laughed. Now it was filled with people who stood because they respected him. Malik took a slow breath. His voice came out low, steady, carrying the weight of 1,000 lessons learned. "When I stood here years ago," he began, "I wasn't a speaker. I wasn't a leader. I was just a scared young man trying to prove that I belonged." He smiled faintly, eyes glancing across the hall. "And when I was insulted in front of everyone, I thought my story ended that night. But it didn't. That moment became the beginning of something far greater than I could ever imagine." The crowd listened in silence. No laughter, no whispers, just hearts wide open. Malik paused, letting the stillness breathe. "I learned something that day. I learned that pain can destroy you or it can define you. And when you choose grace instead of hate, you take back control of your story." He glanced toward the front row, where Rebecca now sat proudly, beside a group of young volunteers from the Belonging Project. She smiled at him through tears, nodding as if to say thank you. Malik continued, "The world doesn't need louder hate. It needs braver hearts. It needs people willing to stand up, not for attention, but for understanding, people who see differences and choose connection over judgment." Then, for a moment, his eyes softened. His tone grew quieter, more personal. "When I was invited to speak at the United Nations, I thought that was my greatest achievement. But I was wrong. My greatest achievement was forgiving the person who once broke me. Because forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the ultimate form of strength." The audience broke into quiet applause. But Malik lifted a hand, gently signaling for silence. "And here's something I realized along the way," he said. "You don't need a big stage or millions of followers to make a difference. You just need one act of kindness, one honest conversation, one choice to say, 'I'll be better than what hurt me.' That's where real change begins." He looked around at the graduating students, their caps shining, eyes bright with hope. "Some of you will face prejudice. Some will face rejection. The world may not always be kind. But I promise you, your power lies in how you respond. Don't let pain make you bitter. Let it make you braver." The students leaned forward, hanging on to every word. "The Belonging Project didn't start because I had a plan," Malik said, smiling softly. "It started because I refused to let hate have the last word. And you can do the same, in your homes, your communities, your schools. Every time you choose compassion, you change the world a little bit more." He took a slow breath and looked up toward the massive banner that hung over the stage. "Class of 2030, the future begins with you." "Yes," he said, reading it aloud. "The future begins with you, not the politicians, not the celebrities. You, because the real revolution isn't fought in the streets, it's fought in our hearts." The audience erupted in cheers, but Malik wasn't finished yet. He stepped forward, his tone rising just enough to send chills through the hall. "Years ago, I stood in this very spot and was told I didn't belong. But today, I want every single person in this room to know you belong. No matter where you come from, what you look like, or how the world sees you, you belong here, and your voice matters. He paused again, then smiled deeply. Because once you believe that no one can ever silence you again, the room exploded in applause, louder than anything the hall had ever heard. Students stood on their chairs, clapping and cheering. Some were crying. Teachers hugged one another. Even the dean wiped away tears behind his glasses. Rebecca stood too, clapping with both hands over her heart. And for a brief, beautiful moment, the entire hall felt united, not by background, not by color, but by hope. Later that night, after the ceremony ended and the hall emptied, Malik stayed behind. The lights dimmed, the echoes of applause faded, and the silence wrapped around him like an old friend. He walked to the exact spot where it had all begun. He could still picture his younger self there, nervous, sweating, trying to find the courage to speak. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up that night." Then he opened his eyes and smiled. The stage, once a place of humiliation, had become a symbol of transformation. Malik picked up his bag and started toward the exit, but before leaving, he turned back for one last look. There, above the stage, engraved in gold letters, were words he hadn't noticed before. Where hate once spoke, love now leads. He stood still, tears welling in his eyes. It felt like a final chapter, not an ending, but of completion. As he stepped outside, the night sky stretched wide and endless above him. The stars shimmered softly, and the air carried the distant sound of laughter from the campus. He tilted his head back, taking it all in, the journey, the pain, the redemption. And with a peaceful smile, he whispered one last line to himself, the words that had carried him through every storm. My story didn't start with hate. It started with hope. Then he walked away, not as the boy who was insulted, but as a man who turned pain into purpose, and whose light would keep shining long after the applause faded.